I want to see everyone's ID.
We're burying my wife. Show me some respect.
Everyone needs to provide identification.
Everyone, or just the black family?
Don't cause a scene at a funeral.
You're the one causing the scene.
You people always make this difficult.
Define you people for the record. This is a security matter. This is harassment during a burial. Step away from the grave. Based on what legal authority?
The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Riverside Memorial Cemetery on April 15, 2025. It was 3:15 p.m., and Robert Washington stood alone at his wife's graveside. Keisha Washington, beloved wife, had lost her battle with breast cancer at just 45 years old. Her casket was now covered with fresh soil, draped with white lilies and pink roses, her favorite colors. Robert stood there, still catching his breath from watching the love of his life disappear 6 feet into the earth. Tears streamed down his face as he clutched tissues with shaking hands. The black hearse was pulling away slowly, respectfully, as other mourners scattered throughout the cemetery, paying their respects to their own departed loved ones. Among those mourners was Maria Santos, visiting her father's grave nearby. She had her phone out, taking pictures of the flowers she'd brought, when she noticed IC vehicles pulling into the cemetery entrance. What Robert Washington didn't know was that he was being watched. Welcome to Justice Zone 365, where profiling is exposed and justice is caught on camera. Hit like and subscribe and tell us where you're watching from in the time right now. Agent Derek Coleman had been with Immigration and Customs Enforcement for 12 years, recently transferred from Border Patrol after what is filed diplomatically called excessive use of force complaints. Coleman didn't just enforce immigration law, he enjoyed it. He got genuine satisfaction from asserting authority over people who, in his mind, didn't belong. He had developed an eye for what he called opportunities, moments when people were vulnerable, emotional, or distracted. Today, scanning Riverside Memorial Cemetery from his vehicle, Coleman spotted what he considered a perfect opportunity. A black man alone at a fresh grave. Potential enforcement action at cemetery, he radioed. Single subject appears suspicious. Coleman had quota pressures. His transfer came with expectations. Prove the move was justified, show results, make arrests. As he checked his equipment, Coleman felt that familiar anticipation building. This grieving widower had no idea what was about to hit him. What Coleman didn't know was that Robert Washington wasn't just any grieving husband. Robert Washington was a federal civil rights attorney with 2 decades of experience dismantling careers exactly like Coleman's. Coleman approached with deliberate authority, his hand resting casually on his belt. "I want to see everyone's ID," Coleman announced, even though Robert was clearly alone. "You can't be here without documentation," Coleman continued, interrupting Robert's private moment with his wife. Robert Washington, despite the overwhelming grief coursing through his system, felt his legal training kick in. His voice remained steady even as tears tracked down his face. "We're burying my wife. Show me some respect." Coleman smirked. He loved it when they thought they could talk back. "Everyone needs to provide identification," Coleman said, his voice getting louder, demonstrating his authority to other cemetery visitors who were starting to notice. Robert's response was precise, clinical, the voice of someone who had spent years in federal courtrooms. "Everyone or just the black family?" Other mourners throughout the cemetery were starting to move away. Maria Santos, however, kept her phone ready and began recording discreetly from behind a large headstone. "Don't cause a scene at a funeral," Coleman said with false concern. Robert looked directly at Coleman, his lawyer's instincts battling his husband's overwhelming grief. "You're the one causing the scene." Coleman felt his authority being challenged. "You people always make this difficult," he said loud enough for others to hear. Robert's response was immediate and sharp. "Define you people for the record." Coleman was starting to realize this wasn't going according to script. Most people became compliant quickly when faced with his badge and authority. "This is a security matter," Coleman said, trying to regain control. "This is harassment during a burial," Robert replied, maintaining that clinical precision that was making Coleman uncomfortable. Coleman decided to escalate. He moved closer, invading Robert's personal space. "Step away from the grave," he ordered. Robert Washington, standing literally over his wife's fresh grave, looked Coleman directly in the eyes. "Based on what legal authority?" Those 6 words changed everything. They revealed something Coleman was beginning to suspect. This wasn't a random grieving widower. This was someone who knew the law. Coleman radioed for backup. Within minutes, 2 more ICE vehicles pulled into the cemetery, their engines disrupting the sacred quiet of the burial ground. The few remaining mourners scattered completely. Maria Santos, still recording, moved to a better position behind the cemetery's maintenance building, making sure she captured everything while staying hidden. If you think grieving families deserve respect and privacy, smash that like button right now. Comment below. What would you do if you saw federal agents harassing someone at a funeral? Your engagement helps these stories reach people who need to see them. Coleman was feeling more confident now that backup had arrived. This was how he preferred to operate, with overwhelming force, with clear demonstration that resistance was futile. "Sir, we need identification immediately," Coleman announced loudly, making sure the other IC agents could hear his commanding presence. Robert's response was measured, careful. "Officer, I am a U.S. citizen at a private burial. What specific law requires identification in this circumstance?" Coleman had heard variations of this question before. His standard response was to dismiss such questions entirely and escalate until compliance was achieved. "I don't care what you think you can show me," Coleman said loud enough for his fellow agents to hear. "Anyone can fake documents. Anyone can claim to be at a funeral." He gestured dismissively at the fresh grave, the flowers, the obvious signs of burial. To Coleman, these weren't sacred objects of grief, they were props that could be manufactured. Robert Washington felt something snap inside him. Not his composure, his legal training was too strong. But something deeper, more primal. This man was desecrating his wife's burial site and treating their grief as performance. Robert's mind flashed back to Keisha's final conversation with him in the hospital. "Promise me you'll keep fighting, Robert? Promise me you won't let them win." Keisha had been a civil rights activist. She had marched, protested, been arrested for sitting in the wrong section of restaurants. "Even in death they won't let us have peace," she had whispered. "But you have the tools to fight back. Use them." Standing over her grave now, Robert understood this confrontation would define everything that came next. Coleman was escalating because Robert's calm responses were frustrating him. He wasn't getting the fear, the compliance, the immediate submission he was used to. "This is standard enforcement protocol," Coleman announced to his fellow agents. "We have reasonable suspicion based on the subject's behavior and refusal to comply." Robert's response was swift and devastating. "Officer, please articulate the specific behavior that constitutes reasonable suspicion. Be precise." Coleman felt his confidence wavering. People were supposed to be intimidated by his badge, his authority, his backup. They weren't supposed to sound like they had spent years in federal courtrooms. Maria Santos, still recording from her hidden position, watched her phone battery drop to 25%. She knew this footage was crucial, but she also knew that getting involved with IC could bring unwanted attention. Other cemetery visitors had cleared the area completely. An elderly woman visiting her husband's grave quickly left. A young couple placed their wreath and departed rapidly. The cemetery was now empty except for Robert Washington and the growing number of federal agents. Coleman's supervisor, Agent Sarah Martinez, arrived in the third vehicle. She had worked with Coleman before and knew his tendencies. When she saw the scene, a clearly grieving man surrounded by IC agents at a fresh grave, she immediately sensed something was wrong. "Coleman, what's the situation?" she asked over radio. Coleman keyed his mic confidently. "Supervisor, we have uncooperative subject disrupting cemetery security. Large gathering refusing to provide identification. Requesting permission to process subject for enforcement action." What Coleman didn't mention was that this was a funeral. He didn't mention the fresh grave, the flowers, the obvious signs of burial. He didn't mention that the large gathering was one grieving widower. He framed everything to justify his actions and protect his authority. Supervisor Martinez approached and immediately noticed the discrepancies in Coleman's report. This wasn't a large gathering, it was clearly one person. This wasn't a security disruption, it was obviously a funeral. And the man Coleman called uncooperative was speaking with the precise language of extensive legal training. "Sir," Martinez addressed Robert directly, "I apologize for the disruption. Can you help me understand what's happening here?" Robert Washington felt a small measure of hope that someone in authority might listen to reason. Officer, my name is Robert Washington. I have just finished burying my wife, Keisha Washington, who died of breast cancer at age 45. I am a U.S. citizen exercising my right to grieve at a private burial. Agent Coleman has demanded identification while I stand over my wife's grave. I have asked him repeatedly to articulate the legal basis for this detention, and he has been unable to do so. Martinez looked at Coleman, whose confidence was visibly shaking. She looked at the fresh grave, the funeral arrangements, the tear-stained face of this man. She looked at Robert Washington, whose calm, professional demeanor suggested this was not someone to be taken lightly. Coleman, step back, she ordered. Sir, do you have identification available? Robert nodded. Yes, ma'am. My identification is in my vehicle, which your agents have blocked. Martinez was beginning to understand the scope of Coleman's mistake. She walked to Robert's car and allowed him to retrieve his wallet. When Robert handed her his driver's license, she noticed something else, a business card that fell out. Washington and Associates, Federal Civil Rights Litigation. Martinez felt her stomach drop. This is exactly why we record everything. Hit subscribe and the notification bell so you never miss these stories. Share this with someone who needs to see how quickly power can be abused. What's your reaction to what Coleman just did? Let me know in the comments. Martinez looked more carefully at Robert Washington's driver's license, then pulled out her phone and made a call. This is Supervisor Martinez, ICE Operations. I need you to run a name for me. Robert James Washington, Doe B. She read off the information and waited. The response came back quickly. Ma'am, Robert Washington is a prominent federal civil rights attorney. He's currently litigating 4 major cases against ICE for discriminatory enforcement practices. He's argued cases before the Supreme Court. His firm has won millions in settlements against DHS. Martinez closed her eyes and felt the career implications washing over her entire team. Coleman had not just harassed a random man. He had harassed one of the most prominent civil rights attorneys in the region while that attorney was burying his wife. She walked back to where Coleman was still trying to maintain control. Coleman, all units stand down immediately. Release the subject and return to vehicles. Coleman couldn't hide his confusion. Supervisor, the subject has not provided. Coleman, stand down. Now. Robert Washington watched the exchange with the calm assessment of someone who had seen this pattern many times before. The moment authority figures realized who they were dealing with, the dynamic always shifted. But the damage was already done. His wife's burial had been violated. His most sacred moment had been turned into a display of federal power. As the ICE agents began retreating to their vehicles, Coleman walked back knowing he had made a catastrophic error. His supervisor wasn't looking at him. His fellow agents were distancing themselves physically and professionally. But Coleman's first instinct wasn't remorse, it was self-preservation and blame-shifting. By the time he reached his vehicle, Coleman was already constructing the narrative that would protect his career. Maria Santos, still recording from behind the maintenance building, captured the entire retreat. Her phone battery was down to 15%, but she had documented everything from the initial harassment through the moment the agents realized their mistake. That evening, Coleman filed his incident report. In his version, Robert Washington had been acting suspiciously in a large gathering that posed potential security concerns. He described Robert as uncooperative and confrontational, and claimed he had refused to provide identification and disrupted cemetery operations. Coleman's report made no mention of the funeral, no mention of the fresh grave, no mention of Robert's obvious grief, no mention of his own inflammatory language or discriminatory targeting. In Coleman's official account, he had responded appropriately to a potential security threat. The ICE legal department received Coleman's report and immediately began damage control. They knew Robert Washington's reputation. They understood this incident, if not handled carefully, could result in massive legal exposure. Within 48 hours, DHS attorneys were crafting strategies to minimize liability. They classified operational details as part of an ongoing security investigation. They instructed agents to preserve all documentation but avoid discussing the incident outside the chain of command. Meanwhile, Robert Washington was making his own preparations. The morning after his wife's burial, he sat down with his legal partners and began documenting everything. They contacted Maria Santos, who provided her phone footage. They began building a case that would expose not just Coleman's individual misconduct, but the systematic problems that made such misconduct possible. 3 days later, Robert Washington filed a federal civil rights complaint against Agent Coleman, Supervisor Martinez, and the Department of Homeland Security. The complaint alleged violations of the First, Fourth, and 14th Amendments, discriminatory enforcement based on race, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Robert knew from experience that the government would fight every step. They would claim qualified immunity, operational necessity, and national security concerns. They would attempt to dismiss the case before discovery could reveal the full extent of departmental problems. Robert also knew Coleman was not an isolated case. His firm began investigating other incidents involving Coleman, other complaints about cemetery harassment, other examples of ICE targeting families during vulnerable moments. What they found was disturbing but not surprising. Coleman had a pattern stretching back years, targeting people of color at weddings, quinceañeras, school events, and religious ceremonies. Each incident had been reported, investigated, and dismissed with minimal consequences. This pattern of abuse happens because people like Coleman think they'll never face consequences. Hit that like button if you believe in accountability. Subscribe for more stories exposing systematic abuse. Tell me in the comments, have you ever witnessed discrimination by law enforcement? Your voice matters. As discovery proceeded, Robert's legal team uncovered internal ICE communications that revealed the scope of the problem. Agents were encouraged to generate arrest numbers through proactive enforcement. Supervisors rewarded agents who showed initiative in identifying potential targets. Training materials taught agents to interpret any resistance to authority as suspicious behavior, justifying escalation. Coleman's personnel file revealed the truth about his transfer from Border Patrol. He hadn't been promoted, he had been moved because of too many complaints about excessive force, discriminatory targeting, and inappropriate conduct. Instead of being disciplined, Coleman had been given a new position with new opportunities to abuse power. The case drew national attention when civil rights organizations learned about the cemetery incident. The ACLU filed an amicus brief supporting Robert Washington. News organizations began investigating other examples of ICE harassment during religious and family ceremonies. Congressional representatives demanded hearings about enforcement policies that allowed such conduct. But justice moved slowly, bureaucratically, with endless motions and delays. Coleman was suspended pending investigation, but continued receiving full pay and benefits while the case wound through federal court. Robert Washington found himself fighting not just for his family, but for every family that had suffered similar violations. He testified before Congress about enforcement policies that treated grief as suspicious behavior. He spoke at civil rights conferences about the intersection of immigration enforcement and constitutional rights. The depositions revealed the full extent of Coleman's misconduct. Under oath, he admitted to targeting people of color because they were more likely to be deportable. He acknowledged enjoying the authority response when people saw his badge. He confirmed that he viewed emotional events like funerals as opportunities because people were distracted and vulnerable. When asked specifically about the cemetery incident, Coleman showed no remorse. "I saw an individual who appeared to be from a country with high deportation rates. In my experience, such individuals often contain deportable subjects." The fact that he claimed to be at a funeral was irrelevant to the enforcement action. Defense attorneys tried to characterize Coleman's conduct as within policy, but the evidence told a different story. Internal communications showed even Coleman's supervisors questioned his methods. Complaint records revealed a pattern of discrimination ignored for years. The breakthrough came when Robert's legal team discovered that Coleman had received specific training on constitutional limitations of immigration enforcement. He had been taught that race alone couldn't justify detention. He had been instructed that religious and ceremonial events required special sensitivity. He knew the law, he had simply chosen to ignore it. 7 months after Keisha Washington's burial was violated, federal judge Patricia Williams issued a ruling that would change enforcement policies nationwide. She found that Agent Coleman had violated Robert Washington's constitutional rights through discriminatory enforcement, excessive force, and deliberate indifference to clearly protected conduct. More importantly, Judge Williams ruled that the institutional policies enabling Coleman's conduct were systemically flawed. She ordered ICE to implement new training procedures, establish oversight mechanisms for enforcement at religious and ceremonial sites, and create accountability measures for agents who engaged in discriminatory targeting. Coleman was terminated 3 weeks after the judge's ruling. The government initially appealed both the ruling and Coleman's termination, but eventually abandoned both appeals when additional evidence emerged of similar misconduct by other agents. Robert Washington received a settlement that compensated him for trauma and legal expenses, but he knew money couldn't repair the violation of his wife's burial site. The real victory was systemic change. New policies required supervisors to personally approve any enforcement action at religious or ceremonial sites. Agents received mandatory training on constitutional limitations and cultural sensitivity. Performance evaluations were restructured to reward community cooperation rather than pure arrest numbers. Agent Coleman found himself unemployable in law enforcement after his termination. His discriminatory conduct had been too well documented, his violations too egregious, for any agency to risk hiring him. The cemetery incident became a training case study at law enforcement academies across the country. New agents learned about Robert Washington as an example of what happens when power is abused, when constitutional rights are ignored, when human dignity is sacrificed for enforcement statistics. At Keisha Washington's grave site, 7 months after her burial, Robert visited his wife in peace. The cemetery was quiet, respectful, protected. Coleman was gone, his career destroyed by his own cruelty and Robert's refusal to accept injustice. Robert placed fresh flowers on Keisha's headstone, white lilies and pink roses, her favorites. "Justice was slow, baby," he whispered. But it came. The work continues. Because somewhere in America, another agent like Coleman is approaching another family at their most vulnerable moment. But now there are precedents, policies, and protections that didn't exist before one agent decided to target the wrong man at his darkest moment. That's how change happens, through ordinary people who refuse to accept abuse and have the tools, support, and determination to fight back. Coleman had the badge, but Robert Washington had something more powerful. He had justice and he knew how to use it. If this story moved you, if it made you believe that fighting back matters, then subscribe right now and turn on notifications. Share this with everyone because these stories don't make the evening news, but they're every day across America. Let me know in the comments. Do you believe one person can make a difference against systematic abuse? Your voice matters, and together we can make sure families get the justice they deserve.